Good afternoon, everyone. We gather on this beautiful spring afternoon to give thanks for the life of Robert Emerson Lucas, Jr., who spent nearly all of his adult life as a distinguished citizen of the University of Chicago. In his Nobel Prize autobiography, he began by mentioning the conversations about religion he shared with his mother from his youth. Since church-going remained a part of his life, I invite those of you whose custom it is to pray to begin our time together with a moment of prayer. May all of us across many faiths and philosophies of life be joined in intention to remember this extraordinary man, to uphold all those who miss him most, especially his family members. Let us pray. O gracious and ever-living God, we remember before you this day Robert. We thank you for giving him to his family, friends, and colleagues to know and to cherish as a companion in work and in life. In your boundless compassion, console all who mourn and make of his memory a continual source of inspiration for those who teach and learn, research and mentor, and all who seek to make the best of this precious gift of life. Grant this for the sake of your love. Amen. A representative of Bob's closest friends and colleagues will introduce themselves in turn and share their reflections. It is always an honor for me to welcome our first speaker to the podium. She is the Harry Pratt Judson Distinguished Service Professor Emerita of History and former president of the University of Chicago, Hannah Holborn Gray.
I'd like to say a few words this afternoon about Bob Lucas's relationship to the University of Chicago. Bob came to the university almost accidentally, but it was a perfect match. The University of Chicago and Bob Lucas were a perfect match from the day he arrived and found his life transformed by the broad liberal arts education, which he treasured as having offered a source of intellectual excitement, one that he maintained throughout his life. Here is what he said about it. This was what he wrote in his Nobel autobiographical essay. He said, "The real excitement for me was in the liberal arts core of the Chicago College. Courses from the Hutchins era with names like History of Western Civilization and Organization Methods and Principles of Knowledge. Everything in these courses was new to me. All of them began with readings from Plato and Aristotle. And I wanted to learn all I could about the Greeks. I took a sequence in ancient history and became a history major." Bob took no economics when he was an undergraduate and almost no math. Instead, choosing history as his major, he became, I think I can safely say, the only graduate of our history department to have won a Nobel Prize. His ambition to become an ancient historian took him, after graduation, to Berkeley. There he was told that though his Latin was very good, he would need Greek before he could do a degree in ancient history. So he began to roam the offerings in European history more broadly, and he came across courses in economic history and the history of economic thought. And those added to an interest he had developed already as an undergraduate when he first encountered the Belgian medievalist Henri Pirenne, a historian who had argued for the primary role of economic factors in causing the disintegration of the Roman Empire, as opposed to the conventional knowledge that Rome had fallen as a consequence of Germanic incursions. As Bob wrote in his Nobel essay, he was excited to find in this thesis of Piran a novel focus that moved, and I quote, away from those terrible Merovingian kings and focus instead on the lives of real people. That same sense of excitement that he found as an undergraduate at Chicago, even beyond expectation, he felt when he began his graduate work at the University of Chicago. He left Berkeley, came back to Chicago, and with remarkable self-discipline, began to prepare himself for graduate study in economics, a field in which he felt a complete novice. And as he began graduate study with such luminaries as Milton Friedman and Arnold Harburger, he found himself learning with and from a remarkable group of fellow students, many of them to become his fellow colleagues as well. Chicago, he said in that same essay from which I'm quoting, had been a marvelous place for him. Now, what made Chicago the perfect match was in large part because what it offered was something he could make his own in an environment that offered extraordinary mentors, colleagues, and students, and in which he was essentially left free to do his own thing wherever it might lead him. In turn, Bob, a man of brilliant and unconventional imagination, helped shape the university itself. Any university deserving of the name, its culture and traditions, its quality and influence, all that has to do with the intellectual vitality of its faculty. It is a cliche to say the faculty make the universities, but we should remember, even without models, that cliches are often true. So Bob Lucas, a man of such imagination and intellect, was a truly great contributor to the cause that I have described. And he helped to make this an institution at which his successors, too, can thrive, historians and economists alike. He was a major source of the culture of rigorous scholarship, questioning, and interchange of the sort that we identify with the university at its best. And Bob himself represented the university at its best.
Good afternoon. I apologize to those in the front row who may not see me. My name is Amanda Woodward, and I am the Dean of the Division of the Social Sciences, a position I've held for about 7 years now. Following Hannah Gray is always a challenge, but I find in my remarks that I will echo much of what she said. I'm honored to be here and actually very humbled to be among this company here gathered who come to remember a very rare scholar, mentor, and colleague. Now, I feel I must say in this room, I am not an economist, and I did not have the pleasure of working closely with Bob Lucas. But from where I sit, I have seen his influence emanate in ways that have been foundational, not only for the field of economics, but also for this place, the University of Chicago. I arrived in the dean's office around the time that Bob became emeritus, and I was actually a deputy dean the year he was awarded the Phoenix Prize, which is the highest honor bestowed by the Division of the Social Sciences. And the Phoenix Prize is awarded only very rarely in the division's history has it ever been awarded, and it honors scholars who, I quote, through the course of their careers, have changed the trajectory of research in the social sciences and have thus contributed to the cycle of intellectual renewal across the disciplines. This was, of course, a very fitting honor for Bob Lucas, one of many, of course, in his career, and one that spoke to his importance here at home at the University of Chicago. Bob, as we have been hearing in the conference these last couple of days, and I'm sure we will hear with the course of this program, was a scholar who fundamentally transformed his field in iterations that spanned his entire career. Others, I'm sure, will comment more precisely and eloquently than I can about that, about his profound influence on the field of macroeconomics and the broad science of economic research. What I want to note is the opportunity I had to see the effect of Bob's intellectual and personal presence on our community at the university. He was, as Hannah noted, a University of Chicago scholar through and through, a college alumnus, a doctoral alumnus, and a faculty member over a long and important arc in the economics department, an arc that he helped to shape. And at the time he was shaping the field, he was shaping the intellectual community on our campus. He interacted with and had profound effect on generations of economists, the students he taught, and the colleagues with whom he was in extended and deep discussion over many years. Hearing from Bob's colleagues, his collaborators, and his past students, as I've had the opportunity to do in my job as dean, I have learned how these interactions, in these interactions, he exemplified, he showed everybody the values that are fundamental to the University of Chicago, probably first and foremost his unflagging commitment to getting it right, to getting closer to the truth, and his impatience with hand-waving, glibness, ego, and everything that is a barrier to unflinching and rigorous inquiry. The discipline he had to be mindful of the limits in one's own thinking, continually driving toward getting ideas more precise, more correct, more powerful. And his generosity in sharing the great gift of his critical attention with students, collaborators, and colleagues, and helping them to question and reshape their own ideas. And finally, I think something that came through so beautifully last night in the comments over dinner, the way he shared his joy in the scientific enterprise, his joy in the work that he did with everyone. So in these ways, Bob Lucas embodied values that are just essential to the University of Chicago. And as Hannah just said, it is really true that a university is its people, its faculty, and it depends on the principles, commitment, and serious-mindedness of its faculty in order to endure. Bob was a model and a mentor to those around him, and an essential force in sustaining our scholarly community and in ensuring its future. So this leads me to say that Bob Lucas had a life and career that we should not only honor, but that we should also be very grateful for. Thank you.
My name is Robert Scheimer. I'm chair of the economics department here at the University of Chicago. I want to reflect on two sides of Robert E. Lucas Jr. today, and I'll call them Professor Lucas and Bob. I knew of Professor Lucas many years before I met Bob. Getting to know of Professor Lucas is why I became a macroeconomist. Getting to know Bob is one of the joys of my professional life. Professor Lucas revolutionized macroeconomics. When Professor Lucas received his PhD from this university in 1964, macroeconomics was a distinct subject from economics. Putting it a bit crudely, economics studied optimizing individuals interacting in markets. Macroeconomics looked at empirical relationships that fit historical data well. Professor Lucas was one of a handful of researchers who understood that fitting historical data may not help with the ultimate goal of economic research, which is improving economic policy and the human condition. This meant that the old macroeconomics had to go. Professor Lucas's genius was to find a way to replace the old macroeconomics with something useful, with economics. He showed us how to study millions of optimizing individuals interacting in markets, sometimes separated across time and space. In work on his own, with others who have already passed, with many people in this room, he demonstrated how his new approach gave insights into classical macroeconomic topics, including monetary and fiscal policy, unemployment, investment, economic fluctuations, and long-run growth. This has been called the rational expectations revolution. I'm going to call it the Lucas revolution. Now, revolutionary ideas take time to permeate the undergraduate curriculum at universities dominated by the pre-revolutionary old guard. Not here. And because of that, and because I was interested in economics, that is, optimization and market clearing, I planned to study microeconomic theory or industrial organization before I started my PhD in 1992. Fortunately for me, the Lucas Revolution had footholds in my PhD program, and so I got to know Professor Lucas early in my doctoral studies. From Professor Lucas's work, I learned how one can use economic principles to explore the biggest questions in the social sciences. And since then, I've strived to be a macroeconomist. I got to know Bob shortly after I received my PhD. During my first few years out of graduate school, I gave a couple of talks in Bob's workshop on campus here. He was also in the audience for every talk at a week-long workshop held each August in Minneapolis. I was intimidated when I first met Bob. After all, he was Professor Lucas. Everything I was talking about must be obvious to him. And anyway, the opportunity cost of his time was too high for him to pay attention to whatever little toy model I was presenting that day. But I underestimated Bob. He always wanted to understand what a paper was about. How did the model work? What did the model tell us about the world? I learned from Bob that a good economic model wasn't a toy, it was a way of understanding some aspect of reality. I remember that Bob asked questions during presentations, but especially afterwards, over beers, over hot dogs and hamburgers in a sweltering park in Minneapolis, over dinner at a restaurant with paper tablecloths that could double as scratch paper. Bob was excited about economics, and Bob's endless enthusiasm and curiosity made economic research useful, exciting, and fun. I got to know Bob better after I joined the faculty here 21 years ago. Lunches, dinners, and meetings were more frequent. I joined Bob for beers on many Fridays on the North Side. Bob and Nancy welcomed me to their homes in Chicago, in Wisconsin. Bob taught me about Chicago's history in his own. Nothing was too mundane. He taught me how to properly pronounce Chicago's street names. It's not Goethe, it's Gothi. Paulina, not Paulina. 6000 North, not 6000 North. I realize now that this may have been his way to turn me, a product of the East Coast and the old guard universities, into a Chicagoan. It worked. But mostly we talked about economics. Bob had an unwavering conviction that good models can help us make sense of rich economic data and guide economic policy. At the same time, he was open-minded about how the economy worked, about what we would discover using the tools of the Lucas Revolution. He was receptive to new ideas and new data. He was eager to engage, discuss, and argue about the assumptions and conclusions in others' research and in his own. Much of Bob's later research examined the process of productivity growth through knowledge accumulation. In his models, individuals periodically meet in pairs, a student and a teacher. During the brief meeting, the student learns the accumulated wisdom of the teacher. In our many years of meetings, Bob was invariably the teacher and I was the student. During those meetings, Bob taught me to do economic research. to do economic research well. He taught me why economic research matters. He taught me how to be generous with my time, knowledge, and friendship. Thank you, Bob.
Hi, my name is Jose Schenkman. I was a colleague of Bob for over 2 decades here in Chicago. He was a very good friend and a very dear mentor. Bob was, of course, an extraordinarily prominent economist. He simply changed the way economists think of macroeconomic phenomena and the way that macroeconomic policy is conducted all over the world. I first became aware of Bob's work when Buzz Brock, who was a teacher of mine and later a colleague, showed me Expectations and Neutrality of Money. I was immediately aware that this was an extraordinarily beautiful and important paper. Elegant is a way that theorists like me use. But I did not even imagine the impact that Expectations and Neutrality of Money would have in macroeconomic research and policy. Now, at that time, the overwhelming majority of policymakers believed that by controlling the rate of growth of money, they could permanently affect the level of employment. Bob showed, however, that once we accounted for the formation of expectations by economic actors, the power of monetary policy to affect employment was greatly diminished. Attempts to exploit the famous inflation-unemployment trade-off that I had learned in graduate school simply led to higher levels of inflation. Bob taught us that monetary authorities should concentrate instead in doing what they could do, that is, using monetary policy to guarantee reasonable price stability. Now, I grew up in Brazil, and as such, I was very aware of inflation, because Brazil, since the early 70s, experienced an acute inflationary process. By the 80s, partly because of attempts to stimulate the economy, rates of inflation were quoted monthly instead of annually. And even at monthly rates, they reached the high two digits. So at the same time, the economy grew very little. However, for the last quarter of a century, in Brazil, as in many other countries, monetary authorities now direct their policy to attain what's called an inflation target, exactly what Bob told them they could do. And this is a good part, a result of the influence of Bob papers in monetary economics and monetary policy. But Bob's work was also highly influential in many other areas, including the theory of asset pricing, the mechanism of economic development, and the determinants of the observed size distribution of firms that Boyan discussed with us early today. Now, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges wrote in a short story called Funes de Memorias that to think is to forget a difference, to generalize, to abstract. Now that fits perfectly Bob's approach to understanding the world. He created all his extraordinary research contribution by constructing highly abstract models that capture the essence of the phenomena he wanted to understand. The elegance and insights of Bob's theoretical models actually bring to mind what the French poet Paul Valéry said about Edgar Allan Poe. He said Poe was the inventor of the newest, the most seductive combination of logic and imagination, the literary engineer who studied and utilized all the resources of the art. I imagine everyone here is familiar with Bob's towering reputation as an economist. Perhaps less familiar, although Nancy did a very good job of explaining this aspect of Bob this afternoon, so this may seem repetitious. But he had broad intellectual interests, and he believed on the importance of many different approaches to social science, and I use the singular in the Chicago tradition. He majored in history at Chicago, and he never lost his interest in the subject, kept great interest in the subject. He championed the essentially ethnographic work of the great urban thinker Jane Jacobs to economists. Bob and I were colleagues for more than 2 decades, and we often discuss topics related to our research. As had been said by many, Bob was a careful reader of his colleagues' work. I try to reciprocate, but you can't reach that level. It's a different level that Bob reached, and was always bringing good ideas and trying to stimulate his colleagues. But we also talk about books we read, especially literary fiction, an interest that we both have. So Nancy mentioned today, for instance, V.S. Naipaul. I met Naipaul through Bob. Bob told me, you have to read this guy. And he was absolutely right. So one time after I left for Princeton, in one of my visits back to Chicago, I found out we're both reading Roberto Bolaño's novel, 2666, which is like this. You know, that's how I remember of it. It was very thick now. I remember also what's in it. But in parts, what that novel does is that it fictionalizes a terrible crime wave that occurred in Juarez, Mexico. The name of Juarez is changed, I think it's Santana or something like this, in the 90s, where a lot of women were killed in this crime wave. I asked Bob what he thought of the book, and the answer was pure Bob. He said, it is a great piece of social science. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Tom Sargent. I sat on the bench on the Carnegie Institute of Technology Economics Department softball team. Didn't get in the game. Bob Lucas was a very good second baseman, and I think he hit 4 out of 5 that day. Bob Lucas liked monotone sequences, and that's all I have to say. So Nancy likes them too. So I'll tell you 2 things. So I wrote a paper with, by the way, Bob Lucas was a good friend and a straight critic. So I wrote a paper with Chris Sims. And Bob was a discussant at a conference. And he wrote up a beautiful discussion. And then Chris Sims and I revised it. And every revision, I sent it back to Lucas. And after about 10 revisions, Bob told me every revision has gotten worse than the previous one. And he withdrew his comment, which was a shame because, okay, that's the first thing. The second illustration is it's about Jose, and it's about how we put monotone sequences to work in real life, a real situation. So I think it was at the University of Chicago, there was going to be Jose's secretary, he was going to be 45 years old. And it was kind of a secret. She planned at lunchtime surprise birthday party for him. It was all secret. Okay. So, those of us who were there, we're told to be there. We were there. And then while I was there, she said, Jose won't come. Why? He's working on paper. He was working on a theorem. He didn't have time to. So every excuse she used, she struck out. So Bob says, let me go, I'll get him. So she goes, and she gets Jose to come. Bob goes and gets Jose to come, and party gets going. I asked about, how did you get Jose to come? He said, oh, I told him to come to the seminar room where the party was and the blackboard, because I had finally figured out and I finally understand the Martingale convergence theorem. Okay, and that got Jose to come. And there's a couple of things that the Martingale convergence theorem played a key role in Bob's paper with Andy Atkinson and other things. But it shows a couple of things how clever he was and how gullible Jose was, because no one understands the Martingale convergence theorem.
My name is Art Rolnick. I was former Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. You've heard generally about the contributions of Bob in so many different ways. I want to give you some concrete examples from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the 9th Federal Reserve District. So Bob was a regular bank visitor starting back in the fall of 2000. While his influence on the research department and the bank was profound, it actually began long before he set foot in the bank. Let me explain. Let me take you back to the year 1971. The bank had decided that we were going to start a major project developing a macro model of the United States economy, and we were going to work with some recent mathematical tools, dynamic programming, to take this model and solve for the optimal rule that we were going to then take to Washington and convince the Board of Governors that we know how to manage the Federal Reserve System. Transformational. We went to our directors. We got this huge budget. We brought in as consultants Tom Sargent, Tom Munch. It was headed by Neil Wallace and Jack Harrican. And we were about 2 or 3 months into the project. Neil Wallace walks out of his office, walks into my office. He's got a paper in his hand. He slams it down on my desk and he says, "Macroeconomics is dead." This was Bob's neutrality paper. It was a draft of his neutrality paper. And, well, that put us in a tough position. I now had to go back to the directors and explain to them that this budget that they made, that we brought in Sargent and Munch and all this thing, that we're not doing this. We're going to micro foundations, as Bob made a strong case for. We've got to go back to real people that underlie our models in their decision-making process. It really means we have to go back to micro foundations, and that's what we started to do with the Minneapolis Fed. Now, fast forward a few years to 1979, we had started a publication that was called the Quarterly Review, and we were trying to build a high-quality research department at the Minneapolis Fed, and this Quarterly Review was an attempt to get our research out to the academic audience. Well, fortunately, Bob and Tom Sargent wrote a paper after Keynesian economics, which we published. Let me tell you how controversial that was, and probably still is today in many circles. Well, that put us on the map, if you will. We were able, going forward, to build one of a world-class research department. We attracted some of the best young scholars in the country, in the world. And so in many ways, despite some difficulties of transforming economics and being in that position to advocate for it, there was a cost. So what was that cost? Well, you have to understand how the Federal Reserve System works. We have 12 district banks, each with its own research department, and then there's a Board of Governors in Washington. And the Board of Governors in Washington has oversight, a little vague what that means, but oversight responsibility over the banks. And every year we would get an evaluation from my counterpart, whose name won't be mentioned, my counterpart at the Federal Reserve, the Director of Research there. And he'd do an evaluation, and this is around 2003, 2004, and this is Bob and Nancy were now regular visitors. And we would get this evaluation about 3-4 years running. Very mathematical department, very esoteric, but irrelevant. Now this goes to my directors. My directors are looking at this for about 3 years in a row, and I got to start worrying about my job, right? Bob, I don't think Bob knew about this, but Bob came up to me one year and said he was working on an AEA paper that he was presenting in the winter, and he said, could I present it to the directors just to give it a trial run? And I believe it was on the Phillips curve. I said, sure, Bob, I'd love to have you in front of my directors. I'd love to have them know there's a Nobel laureate here that was at the department. But a couple of days before he was supposed to speak, he says to me, Art, and I was worried, he called me up, I thought maybe he was going to back out. He says, Art, no, I really want to change the topic. I want to talk about research. Bob, whatever you want to do, it's great. I'd love you having talked to the directors. You decide. So he gave this talk. And what was his talk? He said to the directors, I'm a Nobel laureate. I could go anywhere in the world. I choose to be at the Minneapolis Fed because Next to Chicago, this is the best place to do economic research, and it's relevant. You saved my job. I thank Nancy for this opportunity to speak today, and how lucky and privileged I was to know Bob Lucas.
So, and thinking about these remarks, which I certainly did struggle with for a while, I perfectly anticipated that Rob and Jose were going to do a beautiful job of summarizing the intellectual importance of Bob's work in just very elegant terms. And so I decided I was not going to try to, I could kind of try to maybe put a little bit more of a personal or aspect of my comments. And all I can say is that they did a great job, and yes, absolutely. I arrived in Chicago in 1981, only a few years out of graduate school. I'd just been tenured at Carnegie, and from then on, I was one of Bob's colleagues for almost 40 years. Jose was bragging about 20, but I got him beat by 20 more. And in many respects, I grew up intellectually at the University of Chicago. I mean, this is where, yes, I had a very productive time at Carnegie Mellon, but in terms of intellectual growth, it was just impressive and incredible. I came here knowing well the work of Bob and Jim Heckman. Chicago was, of course, loaded with some other additional serious players: Gary Becker, Sherwin Rosen, the young versions of Jose Schenkman and Sandy Grossman. I'm sorry, Sherwin, yeah, both of whom quickly became important to me. In retrospect, I was lucky to be part of a Chicago economics, particularly in the 80s and into the 90s. It was just amazing. The department was smaller then. Scholars and intellectual leaders like Bob, Jim, Gary cast enormous shadows over the rest of us, and we're forging new paths. How is a young professor supposed to handle this? I don't know, good question. So Chicago, the so-called Chicago School, which I'm never quite sure how to define, from the 1960s held that economic research should be enhanced with conversations across specializations. Friedman, before my time, had written on money, but insisted on teaching price theory. Everyone was encouraged to converse across subfield boundaries. Workshops and intellectual engagements were tough. Direct criticism might sting, but it made research better. Little or no effort went to patting others on the back. That just didn't happen. Direct criticism, that's what it's all about. Looking back, I'm not sure how much fun it was to come into work. People talk about Bob was having fun as a researcher. I found it challenging, stimulating, but I'm not sure fun was the first thing that comes to my mind when I came in the morning. But the intellectual challenge drove survivors into making intellectual advances. It helped shape my goal to embrace formal modeling and to create investigative empirical methodologies informed by theory. Upon arrival, I had already been reading and studying Bob's papers from the 70s, going all the way to the time I was a graduate student. These provided an impressive path by formulating and applying dynamic economic models. I remember reading in great detail and his eye-opening work on investment under uncertainty with Ed Prescott. In order to understand this, I had to do a deep dive into, like appendices, C or whatever. I mean, to really understand this work. And I just, by the time I really fully digested it, I had such a better perspective on the construction and building of dynamic models and that pertinent for economics and elsewhere. Of course, the celebrated and innovative expectations and the neutrality of money was impossible not to appreciate. I wrestled with what's called the critique paper, and I find it often cited in just stunningly superficial ways. That paper was particularly valuable for the questions it posed and the subsequent thinking it drove, even while it necessarily left issues open. These were all fundamental to my personal education, even before arriving at the university. After coming to Chicago, I was able to witness the emergence in the 80s of what I see as the Lucas program, following from what Rob Scheimer called the Lucas Revolution. So the Lucas program for research in macro-related topics. An impressive collection of scholars throughout the entire economics professions pursued and continue to pursue a research program that Bob set the agenda for. And I remember one conversation really well that's connected to this. It was over coffee. I was trying to figure out what the rules should be of kind of research collections and the like. And so he talked very openly about the sociology of research, the gains that having a group of scholars agree to focus on a set of questions, at the same time tossing aside others to nurture research productivity. So the tossing aside was an interesting aspect of this that really stuck with me. Anyway, it was a remarkably open and frank discussion that I really helped me get a much better insight over research in general. Importantly, the impact of Bob's insights into economics, they pervade much. They go much beyond what I call the so-called Lucas program. They invaded a variety of subfields in economics, well beyond macroeconomics. And I felt this particularly in my own research, which I found at the boundary of maybe this the community of scholars that Bob nurtured. Certain interactions with Bob had a long influence on me. So lots of people in the last few days have talked about, Lucas would like this, or I was happy when Lucas would like this or the like. So once Bob and I were going to an MBR conference at Stanford. Bob was presenting one of his papers incorporating money demand into a modeling framework. I think it was one of his important papers with Nancy. Bob's discussant was Milton Friedman, who Bob obviously had great respect for. This was one of the few times that I witnessed Bob being intellectually nervous. I mean, he was this was a big issue. It's kind of a big consideration for him. But it was very revealing to witness what unfolded. He fully anticipated Milton's criticism. For him, there was no surprise in the discussion. He had already thought things out, and while I'm sure he would have liked to have had Milton's praise, he was convinced of the value of his research and didn't need it. This to me was also a very important lesson. So anyway, it's in a very important sense, Bob, and this is true of other University of Chicago intellectual leaders that I admire, did not just play follow the leader, the incrementalist game. Rather, they all read widely, built on the prior advances, and took giant steps in new directions. I remember feeling very privileged when Bob invited me to sit at the head table of the American Economic Association meetings in a session recognizing and honoring his Nobel Prize. There are also a few other very memorable occasions where Bob told me how better to frame my research and what to emphasize in writing. I listened and learned much from these interactions. I always remember Bob Lucas as a truly unique scholar, someone fully committed to keeping up the exceptional qualities of Chicago economics and the University of Chicago. He was completely committed to both. It was my privilege to have him as a colleague for many years, and like many others around him, I received substantial and durable benefits, and I will always treasure the best of these intellectual exchanges. Thank you.
Okay, hello, I'm Anil Kashyap. I'm a member of the business school faculty and also have had the privilege of being Bob's colleague for 30 years. Like Lars, I had perfect foresight and rational expectations. I knew everybody else was going to talk about the research, so I'm not going to talk about that. I thought it would be helpful to talk about his collegiality and some more specificity than we've heard, and in particular, how he helped inspire young faculty. I've been flooded with memories thinking about all the different examples I might pull up. In fact, at the conference yesterday, I got 2 more examples from people that were there about stories of things Bob did over and beyond the call of duty when they were young. I first got to know Bob across the street at the lunch table at the Quadrangle Club at the lunches that Merton Miller used to host. Mert loved to talk about economics and current events while having lunch, and he welcomed any member of the faculty to join him, including new assistant professors. The only expectation is you had to be ready to engage in the conversation and stand your ground if you were not down with the direction that the conversation was going. Bob was a regular at Mert's table, so was Gary Becker, Sherwin Rosen, Peter Pashigian, several others that are here, Derek, Jose, George Constantinides. And within 3 months of moving to Chicago, I'd probably had lunch with Bob a dozen times. And that was just so empowering. It made me feel like, okay, I'm part of this community. And I watched this same thing over and over and over again. Every time somebody new got hired in the department at Booth, Bob at some point would reach out to him, get to know him, ask him what they were doing, give him some feedback. And I'm sure you could collect a book of stories. The one I heard yesterday, I'm going to deviate from the script for a second, was Derek Neal was at one of these lunches and talking about this paper he wanted to write. And Bob at some point says, enough with this chat, let us see some equations. And he starts sketching out a model for Derek that ended up turning into a paper that Tom helped him finish later on that won a prize. That was the kind of thing that he just did and couldn't help but doing. And so I think that's not the view that you have of Professor Lucas if you're not trained here, but it was very real. Soon after, Bob and Nancy became sidekicks in organizing these regular Friday afternoon happy hours for the faculty. Initially, we'd meet in the pub in the basement of Ida Noyes, and we wound up with a pretty eclectic group, people from the Harris School, the business school, the department. And for new faculty, again, I just watched how amazed they were to discover that on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, Bob Lucas would just go and hang out at the pub and talk to them about whatever they wanted to talk about. Because Bob and Nancy and I all lived in Lakeview, we decided to move the happy hour to Lakeview. And after we did that, a number of faculty from Northwestern, the Chicago Fed, began joining. And we added a dinner where people would have lots of time to interact. I think there's at least a dozen people that used to come to those happy hours, some of whom have flown across the country to be here. That wasn't just a purely social thing. I think it was very important in the way the macro community at Chicago evolved. We had been running parallel workshops in the business school and the econ department for forever, and we tried to merge them in various ways, and we never got any sustained success. I think once we started having those gatherings and people got to know each other much better, we took a big leap forward. Now, it's taken a lot of effort from many people here to get to the point where now all our workshops are fully joint. We almost fully collaborate on recruiting. And Chicago at this point has the biggest collection of macroeconomists in any major university. And it's a very tight family. And there's no doubt that that's in no small part due to Bob and Nancy. So that wouldn't have happened without that leadership and commitment to the community. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the countless Cubs games that Bob attended with other economists. Bob had a ritual that I loved. He'd always buy a program and start out scoring the game using a pen. Okay, crazy to use a pen, but Bob would use a pen, and he had that impeccable handwriting. So he'd be scoring the game. And then after about 4 innings, the beer would start to kick in. He'd have to go to the bathroom, and he'd hand me the scorecard. He says, okay, Neil, you take over. He'd get back, and there's all this chicken scratching across the program. And I, expect him to hit me with it someday, but he never did. He was always graceful about that. But he used those times at Wrigley Field to find out about what a lot of other younger faculty, usually microeconomists or financial economists, he knew what all the macro people were doing. And I have many memories of somebody getting this look of excitement. I've got a one-on-one with Bob Lucas where I can pitch my paper. My favorite one of these involves Amit Seru, who some of you will know. He's now at Stanford. He had a paper about how banks had mismodeled the house price crash during the global financial crisis. And the paper was called The Failure of Models That Predict Failure. The core idea was that in the early 2000s, when house prices were rising, banks began to calibrate their models of default. Once prices started falling, the correlations that they had taken as given kind of fell apart, and the models stopped working. Amit thought this was a super clever, important application of Bob's famous modeling critique. And the week that we were going to this game, he had gone to another university where he said half the seminar was spent on a fight over whether or not this was or wasn't an application of the Lucas critique. And he had the whole seminar completely ruined because of this, ideological debate. So at the game, Amit sits down, he's got Bob next to him, he starts explaining to him, and Bob immediately gets it and says, that's a great example of my critique. I don't think I've ever seen a smile as broad as across Amit's face at that moment. Anyway, so let me stop here. My lasting memories will always include of Bob, smiling on a sunny day watching baseball at Wrigley, where he's equally happy chatting about work or with Bob the beer vendor or talking to the owner of the team. Thank you, Bob.
We're fortunate to have among us members of Bob's family, his brother Peter, sons Stephen and Joseph, granddaughter Ginger, and spouse Nancy. Thank you for sharing him with the University of Chicago community. Peter?
First, let me say how absolutely wonderful it was to sit here and listen to these marvelous comments. It was also nice for me to be able to put some faces together to some of the names that Bob has been talking about for years, actually for decades in some cases. Also want to thank Nancy for her role in all of this and for being such a help to Midge and I in answering our questions. Bob was my roommate. We shared the same bedroom growing up the entire time we were in school. We lived in a 3-bedroom house in the Ravenna district of Seattle. Bob was my roommate again when he came home in the summers of his undergraduate school. Our sister Jennifer was actually born between us, and the three of us were really close. We played a lot of games together. There was always a jigsaw puzzle under construction in the house, and the games got more sophisticated as we got older. They went from card games to played Risk and Monopoly. Dad taught us poker, cribbage, and gin rummy, and eventually taught us bridge. And we were all bridge fanatics in the summers that Bob would come back from Chicago during his undergraduate years. We lived on a dead-end street, so that was the place for all the neighborhood football games and soccer games and baseball games would be played until we outgrew the dead-end street. And Bob's pals in those days, I remember, called me a little Lucas, and I always thought that was a nice thing to be. Our parents were liberals. My father was a member of the Pipe Fitters Union. Our mother was a fashion artist, and she was a member of the Seattle Civic Unities Commission, and I was a big fan of Adlai Stevenson. And I remember she had tears in her eyes when Stevenson lost to Eisenhower back in 1952, first time. So yes, Bob's views did change through the years. We both loved baseball a lot, and we'd go to the Seattle Rainier baseball games, and Bob taught me how to keep score, so we would both keep score during the games, and we'd often play catch in the side yard after dinner. Bob, Jennifer, and I all had summer jobs when we were in high school, and I thought I would mention some of Bob's jobs. Bob was, one summer he and some pals rented a house in the Skagit Valley that was next to a plant where they were processing food products from the crops. And another summer, they did the same thing in Walla Walla. One summer, he crewed on a fishing boat out of Seattle to fish in Alaska. When he became a permanent resident of Chicago, Bob would come to Seattle 2 times a year, almost every year until a few years ago. He would come always at Christmas for the annual family party, and would come in the summertime for a visit. We all love Bob and miss him, and we're also terribly proud of what he's accomplished here with all of you.
I'm Steve Lucas, Bob's son. He was an amazing father. First of all, he was just around the house a lot. I think he worked sort of 9 to 5-ish at the university, and come home for dinner, maybe hang out before dinner. And then after dinner, he would set up shop in the kitchen and work, sometimes for hours into the evening. I can still hear the rat-tat-tat of his 2 index finger typing style and the wham of the carriage return. And my brother and I, sometimes together, sometimes at different times, we would, find ourselves in the kitchen for various reasons, having a snack, or maybe we'd be out with friends, and when we'd come home, we'd stop in at the kitchen, hang out with Dad for a while. Occasionally he would say, I can't talk right now, I really got to focus on this. But 90% of the time, he was totally interruptible. And he would just engage with us with whatever we were talking about, whether it was something that might lead to an intellectual discussion, or whether we were telling him the crazy things that we and our friends were getting up to. And you could tell, he just loved hearing what we were talking about, in many of the stories that were told here today. I can recognize that he really listened intently to what people were saying and engaged fully. And, so to be his kid and to have that, it was awesome. Through the various discussions that we had, he was sort of teaching by example. in the way he would engage, the way he would reason, the way he would ask questions. But it never, ever felt like a teaching. I've never, maybe I'm only thinking about that really today, hearing everybody else's stories, but it just felt like a conversation between friends or family. I think one of the most remarkable things about him as a parent is that he was completely non-judgmental. And he was a very, very low-pressure parent, which is maybe surprising. I'm hearing stories about people who maybe found his presence at times challenging or intimidating, but he wasn't like that with us. He just, engaged like a peer. It was a wonderful way to grow up. And, he's spending time with him just felt really, really good. And, all through my life, I've, come back to Chicago and visited. And I just loved hanging out with him and talking about whatever, just being in the same room. I feel blessed to have had him as my father. Thank you, Dad, for being the best father that this world has ever seen.
Hi, I'm Joe, Bob's son as well. It's been great to hear all the words from his friends and colleagues in economics here. Dad was an economist through and through. I remember visiting him and Nancy during the 2008 financial crisis, and he told me he was waking up in a panic in the middle of the night every night with one question on his mind. Was there anything that he could say or do that would help the economy in some way? It was all he could think about. But as much as he was consumed by economics and as hard as he worked at it, he had many other sides to him as well. As Steve so eloquently expressed, he was a loving and deeply involved father. He was also naturally upbeat, high-spirited, social. He enjoyed life tremendously. He loved being around people, and he was a source of great joy for me. I want to share a few favorite memories of Dad. In the late 1960s and early 70s, we lived in a house on Whiteman Street in Pittsburgh that had a big front porch and an awning. On summer nights after dinner, Dad would take our TV set outside and we'd watch the Pirates game on the porch. He'd bring the chessboard out. Our neighbors, the Greenbergs, would come over. Great times. When I was in second grade, our neighborhood movie theater ran a Marx Brothers revival, and Dad was a big Marx Brothers fan. That fall, he took me and my best friend Jeremy to a bunch of Marx Brothers movies. At his favorite, A Night at the Opera, the three of us got into an uncontrollable laughing fit that seemed to go on forever. In the early 1990s, my wife Tanya and I were living here in Hyde Park, and Dad and Nancy were living in Lincoln Park. We saw each other a lot during that time, and they cooked lots of great dinners for us at their place on Berry Avenue. One spring Saturday morning during this era, Tanya and I decided to go up to the north side and walk around and people watch. It was a beautiful day. The streets were packed. We were walking north on Halstead, and who should we come across walking south? Dad, out enjoying the day. We had lunch at one of his favorite spots and spent the afternoon together talking about all kinds of stuff. I miss him.
Hi everyone, I'm Ginger and I'm Bob's granddaughter. Grandpa Bob was a fun and easygoing grandparent. We were lucky to have frequent visits with him at both our home in Massachusetts and in Chicago. Pictures that my siblings, cousins, and I have from our early lives show him pushing our plastic cars and strollers and laughing as we ate birthday cake with our hands. He was always on the sidelines during many basketball and soccer games and was up for throwing the baseball around in the backyard. In 5th grade, when I was assigned to do a project on someone famous, I decided to choose him. My teacher was delighted and invited him to come and speak to my class, which he gladly accepted, even if this audience was a little bit different from his usual. This was a big deal in our small town and even featured in the local newspaper. He was warm, down to earth, and a natural at translating his thoughts and economic concepts to 5th grade students. He loved his cat Clementine and our family dog Pax, driving, taking walks in the state park by our house, and sitting around at the table having lively conversations about everything from food to politics to sports, you name it. He passed on his love of Chicago, especially Hyde Park. When my brother Mike and I visited alone one summer, the first thing we did was go on a memorable tour of all of his favorite spots. We are so grateful for the time we got to spend with him and lucky to call him our grandpa.
Hi, I'm Nancy, and it was my great good fortune to be Bob's spouse for almost 40 years. Most of you remember Bob as an economist, and you know he was passionate about economics. But he was passionate about many things: classical music, gardening, reading, baseball. In reading, especially history and fiction. And Bob loved his car, and he loved driving, and he loved hiking. He especially loved days that combined both driving and hiking. So during our first long visit to the Minneapolis Fed, we took a trip up to the North Shore of Lake Superior over the Thanksgiving weekend and went hiking. It was Bob's first hiking trip, and my first in a long time. So we had started, in Minneapolis. We both got outfitted with hiking boots and warm socks and jackets and hats at a place called Midwest Mountaineering. Bob loved it. We made many other trips to the North Shore together, but Bob also did quite a few by himself. When there was no long weekend, he would just start out early in the morning, drive up to the North Shore, do the first hiking trail up and down. It was a good trail, and drive back that evening. In Chicago, he did the same thing with the Indiana Dunes. If it was a beautiful, sunny day, clear blue skies, he would just announce at breakfast, "I'm off for the dunes." And he would drive down to the dunes. He had a favorite hiking spot there, do his hike, have lunch, and come home. So Bob loved many, many things. But perhaps most of all, he loved people. He loved his family, his colleagues, and his students, and his many, many friends. So he loved living, and it was, I think, his love of people that made him love living.
Thank you for those deeply personal reflections. I invite you to rise as you are able and join in a moment of silence. May Bob continue to rest in peace. May let light perpetual shine upon him. May his memory be a blessing to all of us, inspiring us to approach our lives and our work with wonder and with joy. Amen.